Good evening. It's great to see so many people here today. It's not intimidating at all up here. So I've got a bit of a provocative title there, My Computer Wants Me Dead, and probably the majority of the time that's not true. But sometimes it is true, yeah. But it really is an exciting time, as Joanna said. The University of Waikato coming into the bay, the great new facilities in the centre of town really are going to be a centrepiece for the University of Waikato, and we're super excited. I'm based out at Blake Park, the Adams Centre for High Performance there, and we're really lucky to be alongside some great and dedicated athletes training out of there, and there's a really great feel. We've actually got a couple of PhD students in the audience up the back there. Thanks for coming along, Francesco and Ivana. So right up front, I want to say that I'm a PhD. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm going to present some information today which I find really interesting, but they're just sort of suggestions and guidelines. I'm not going to be telling you medical advice, and I want to sort of stress that a little bit. Like I say, we have a talented team out at the Adams Centre. You may have been along to one of the lectures already by Dr Kim Mabialozier, who gave a talk on running earlier in the year, and we have a couple of other great doctors out there that do some really great stuff. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit here. Can we all hear okay? Yep, cool. So yeah, I'm Martyn Beaven. I'm originally from Rotorua, so yep, go the Bay, go the Steamers. I came to the University of Waikato from Rotorua and studied a Bachelor of Science in Technology and Chemistry. Feels like a long time ago. I went away and worked in chemistry for a little while, and then I was fortunate enough through a change in circumstance to be able to sort of take some of the expertise that I gained during that time working and combine that with a passion of mine, which is sport and high performance sport. And I was able to do a Masters in Sports Exercise study at Wintec. Boo hiss, the opposition. Same for AUT, boo hiss. I did my PhD through AUT and was fortunate enough to be supervised by Dr Nicholas Gill, who's the current strength and conditioning coach for the All Blacks. After that, I was very fortunate actually. I picked up a postdoctorate in Östersund in the middle of Sweden. People from Stockholm would say it's very north Sweden, but actually it's almost exactly in the geographical centre of Sweden, about 6 hours north from Stockholm on a train. Yeah, it's pretty cold. I was there for a couple of years and then had the opportunity to move to the Athletic Performance Lab in Lincoln, Nebraska, America. So go Big Red. And I worked there as a physiologist for some time, and then was offered a job to come to Kuala Lumpur, the ISN, or Institute Sukarno Negara, the National Sports Institute of Malaysia, where I was the head of strength and conditioning. So there's a few teams there that I've worked with through the years, been very fortunate to work with some great and dedicated and passionate people. But probably one of the highlights of my career to date in sports exercise science would be the time I spent with some of these para-athletes in Malaysia. I'm not sure, you probably don't recognise these three guys. Malaysia had never won a gold medal prior to the Rio Olympics. So here we have Zihad, Rizwan Puzi, who won the 100 metres, fastest guy in the world. Zihad, world record shot put, and Latif Romley, world record and gold medal obviously in the long jump, 7 metres 60 I think he jumped. So, this is me, and I've got a big light bulb next to my head, which generally shows that I've had a great idea. Not in this case, sorry. I'm really sorry about that. Basically, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit today, and it's sort of a bit of a story, and I'll tell you a bit of a story of how I came to be telling you this story today. Just through maybe my time in Sweden, and also some other things that I learnt through doing my PhD. But I think we all know that the world we live in today is very, very different to the world we lived in, or our parents lived in, and your grandchildren obviously experience very different lives to what you had growing up. So that presents a lot of challenges. It's great. There's a lot of exciting opportunities. There are jobs that exist now that never existed before. But there's also a lot of challenges associated with the change in our lifestyle. And we're a little bit more sedentary now. I'd say in some ways, the modern lifestyle hasn't really been as beneficial for us as some people might think. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit of a story. And so this is a really strong chicken. So when I was doing my PhD, I had to do a literature review, and I was working with rugby players. We were looking at testosterone and how we can make sure we're maximising testosterone, because that's a great way of building muscle, it's a great way of being able to maintain muscle. Hi Fee, you're late. And so I was just doing a little bit of reading. I was a diligent student, obviously, and I came across this really amazing study, how blue light could really influence the amount of muscle mass in the subjects of this study. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Why do people not know about this? But the trouble was, it was in the Journal of Poultry Research. So it was in chickens. So they would grow these chickens, and they'd learnt that over time, the chicken farmers had learnt that if they put a blue light 10 centimetres above the heads of these chickens as they were growing, then they would get much, much more muscular, which is great for chicken farmers because that's the meat that they're selling to you and me to eat. Yeah. And they actually did an experiment. It showed if you used green light, if you used red light, if you used blue light, or you just used normal light, these chickens would be have about 20% more meat on them if they were grown under blue light. And that was related to testosterone. The testosterone that was flowing through their blood was that much higher in those chickens. So that's sort of opened my eyes a little bit to the effects that light can have, and I sort of started looking into other effects that light might have on the body. And so this is our Roy G. Biv. We all know the rainbow. So blue light's sort of at the top end there. So we'd call it a short wavelength light as opposed to red, which is more of a long wavelength. Obviously infrared would be off the bottom there, and ultraviolet would be off the top. And it just learning about some of these effects of light on the body that aren't just related to how we perceive things, how we see things. So that's called the non-image forming effects of light. I like to liken that to our ears. So we know our ears are useful for hearing, but we also know that our ears help us with our balance and being able to maintain our balance. So our ears have these two uses. The same with our eyes. So our eyes are used to be able to see and perceive things, but they also take in this other information from light that's not actually to do with seeing. It's actually to do with being able to know what time of day it is, when we should be going to sleep, when we should be up, when we should be out foraging or working or getting to work, KP, 9 o'clock. So when I learnt about the effects of blue light in chickens, I actually learnt a little bit about how blue light can influence a range of things, including our cognition, but also how red light has these effects and can actually penetrate our skin and is actually quite useful in some forms of pain management. So this red and blue, they're not just useful for telling which Smurf is the most important. So one of the key studies that I looked at or found came out in 1991. It was in the Journal of Comparative Physiology, and they were looking at the effects of this very specific wavelength of light, the blue wavelength of light, on blind mice. I didn't actually bother to look up how many mice they used, but I'm assuming they used 3. So now we know that mice are nocturnal. So they're up and about during the night time. That's where they scurry around and steal the cheese. And during the daytime, they're pretty inactive. That's when they're sleeping. And because they're nocturnal, they don't really rely on sight very much. So your average mouse is actually technically blind. If you put up the Snellen chart, the eye vision chart there, they don't have 20/20 vision. They have 20/200 vision. So 20/20 vision means that if you're 20 feet away, you can read that line, 4 lines up from 6 metres away when you're at the doctor's chart. Probably can't see it at the back there. Can you see that, Tim? Can you see the 20/20 line? Can you see the 2012 line? So if you're a mouse, you have 2200 vision, which means pretty much if you go to the doctors and they test your eyes, this is what you can see. A pretty blurry E at the top of the chart there. So if you're a blind mice, you are really blind, okay, because that's a normal mice can see 22. But what they showed is that if they showed these blind mice, so they had zero ability to see anything at all, if they presented them with blue light, they still knew if it was daytime or nighttime. They knew if it was time to be up and around feeding or if it was time to be sleeping. So even though they couldn't see the light, that they physically had damaged eyes so they couldn't see anything, they still knew what time of day it was if you presented them with this blue light. So that's this non-image forming. It's nothing to do with sight, but it is giving them information about what time of day it is and where we are in our biological rhythm. And humans have exactly that same rhythm. So actually, Florence Nightingale was one of the first people to recognise this, and way back in 1959 she published a book called Notes on Nursing, and in that book she said that sunlight is directly entering the hospital room was absolutely necessary for patients to recover. So she knew this a long time ago. Through her observations and the way that she worked, I looked her up on Wikipedia, and it actually lists her as a statistician, and she was an amazing woman. But more recent research, we've actually seen that people that have gone in for coronary surgery, the amount of time they stay in hospital after their surgery is actually related to how much sunlight they see in that hospital room. There's also research out of Osaka University in Japan. It's a very similar thing. People that have gone in for surgery to have cancerous cells removed from their esophagus, 2 days earlier they're up and about and ready to go. If their hospital room faces, has a big window but is able to see some natural sunlight versus those people that don't. There's another study with I think they had about 89 subjects. What's going on here? And they basically showed that in hospital, if people had a room that was looking out, had a nice sunny day, not quite like today, maybe a little sunnier than today, they used 22% less pain medication. So obviously that's great for the patient to be experiencing less pain. It's also actually pretty good for the hospital. They pay for less pain drugs for the patients. So we see that this exposure to natural light, and specifically this wavelength of light, the blue light, is actually really important for how we can recover, and it actually has a lot of difference to our physiological processes associated with that. But there's also some interesting research around cognition, and there's an interesting study done in a lecture hall, not too dissimilar from this, but it didn't have any natural light. And what they did was they put up a test on the screen, and basically all you had to do was read across there'll be a number of letters on the screen, and you just had to read across and see how far you got. Anyone want to give it a go? Tough, I'm going to do it anyway. So is everyone ready for? So there's going to be some letters come across just underneath whoever that is on the screen. Okay, are we ready? So how did we go? Anyone get to the end? Anyone get to V? V for victory? Good work. Not a lot of you though, eh? So what I like to tell people is if I'm not sounding very smart up there, that's because I don't have an office with a window. So that was in a lecture hall, and basically they exposed people to blue light. So they just had blue light bulbs in the roof. They exposed them for 20 seconds. They just turned it on for 20 seconds, and they showed that using that test, which is a pretty good test of fluid intelligence or your ability to take in information, that 20 seconds of blue light improved people's IQ, their fluid intelligence or their IQ, by approximately 5 IQ points. 20 seconds of exposure to blue light. So we should be using this in classrooms, right? People should have classrooms that have natural light. It makes a lot of sense, right? So there's been a few people that have studied this. That there is a study in Trends in Neuroscience and Education showing that classrooms that do have access to natural lighting, the kids do a lot better in terms of their cognitive processing speed. They do a lot better in terms of their ability to focus and concentrate. There's a study from Holland that I won't try to pronounce because Erica and Marco, they're my neighbours, will tell me that I've pronounced it wrong. Great to see you though. They had 89 students come in. 89 students come in, and again they showed this positive effect of natural lighting on the scholastic ability of the students. And probably the most compelling story was there's some work that came out of America. 8,000 students. They were from all across America, some places that get quite a lot of natural daylight, other places not so much. They found this association between the presence of daylight and student performance, and they actually went on to say the things we're measuring, the concentration, this ability to focus, our ability to think, they probably should be translated across into the workplace. So this is actually a picture of one of my workmates, Dave. So he's missed his 10 o'clock coffee, and it really has not turned out well for him. There was one study that came out from northern Scotland. So northern Scotland, a little bit like where we were in Östersund, doesn't get a lot of natural light at certain times of the year. They had about 100 plus workers, and they had two stories. That was a call centre, so 2 floors, and in one of the floors they installed lights that were more like natural sunlight. The other floor, not so much. And what they did, they had them all in one floor for a while, and they switched them over so they could see the effects of this natural sunlight on their performance. And it was a call centre, so they could measure how many phone calls did they answer, how were they doing. And actually, maybe not surprising to you after seeing some of this information, they actually did answer more phone calls, but also it improved a lot of their other metrics they were measuring. It improved how well they perceived that they slept. It improved their eye discomfort, so they didn't get the sore eyes after sitting in front of the computers all day. It improved their irritability, which would be great for my workmate Dave because he gets irritable. It worked, and it also improved their mood and their sense of well-being, which is obviously really important. There's another study a little bit later on, and they again showed that having an office with windows versus the people on the other side of the building that didn't have the windows, basically having that office with being able to see out and see the natural light there lowered the level of stress. The people without a window had higher stress levels. They measured the cortisol in the blood, and they also measured the amount of melatonin. So melatonin is sort of that hormone that tells us to go to sleep. So during the day, our melatonin is really low, but when the sun goes down, our melatonin starts going up, and we get sleepy. Yep. So what they did, that they measured this stress hormone and melatonin and showed that they were actually quite different between the groups that were in the office with a window and the office without, and actually that was related to how well they slept, but also some depressive symptoms. So during my time in Sweden, I was actually fortunate enough to work with some pretty good athletes, biathlon athletes. They ski and then they shoot. Are we pretty familiar with biathlon? Yeah, so what we did, we just were interested to see, do they shoot better, because we're talking about improved cognitive ability, improved alertness. Are they actually able to shoot better or perform better when it's a nice sunny day versus some of the competitions they hold at night? So, and actually what we found is they missed an extra 1.5 shots when the competition was at night. Now, we went and asked them, you guys can see the target, right? Like there's big lights and everything that they could actually see the target. They're like, yep. And 1.5 shots may not sound like a lot, but in biathlon you have this penalty loop. So every time you miss a shot, you have to do an extra 200 metres. So if you miss a shot and the guy next to you doesn't, then good luck catching him again. Yeah. And we did another study while in Sweden. I worked with a student from psychology that was doing his master's there. And we looked at decision making and reaction times, comparing caffeine with blue light. And what we actually found was that caffeine did help you with your reaction time, but it also made you make a few more mistakes when you were trying to choose between trying to make a decision. Whereas blue light improved your reaction time, but you also were less likely to make these sort of accuracy errors. Unfortunately, I couldn't really think of any sports where having a fast reaction time and making good decisions was was useful, so we sort of shelved that research. One thing we did find from that study was it seemed as though the effect was larger in people with blue eyes. So it may be that we know a lot of Scandinavian people and people from the Arctic sort of area do tend to have blue eyes. It may be that that helps them during those periods where there isn't a lot of natural sunlight around, that they are a little bit more sensitive to the effects of light. And a little bit of potentially supporting information for that is in these reindeers, and they hang out in the Arctic Circle, and this is just for you, Erica, the reindeer portion. And actually their eyes change colour. In winter their eyes are blue, in summer their eyes are red. So this is a deer that they've found with the blue eyes there. And they say again that that's probably an evolutionary process so that they're able to be more sensitive to the really low levels of light that are around during the winter periods in the Arctic Circle. So we have sort of talked about a little bit about the mood in the workplace and the effects of having that more natural light in the mood, more natural light helping us with our mood. And we all sort of know on a sunny day people are generally a little bit happier. So the student I was working with in Sweden, he actually measured the effect on mood of this blue light intervention we gave them, which was just sitting under a blue light for about an hour. And we did show really positive effects on mood through blue light. It's pretty well known that like I say, the seasonal affective disorder during the winter in the Scandinavian countries is quite a big issue. You do see, sorry. You do see quite high levels of this depressive type disorder during the winter. It can be up to 10% of the population suffers from seasonal affective disorder. In America, there's actually stats showing that seasonal affective disorder probably affects around 1% of people in Florida, but about 10% of people in Alaska. So depending on where you are and the length of the days and the night, it can make quite a big difference. And we actually, it's pretty well known that light is an effective intervention to try and assist or to treat some of these affective disorders. So with Mental Health Week coming up, maybe it's a good idea for everyone to get outside and see a little bit of sun, and maybe that's why daylight savings is timed just right for that. I will come back to that a little bit later. So I've been standing up here saying that blue light is great, this natural light is great. What gives? I thought it was supposed to be, hey, this stuff's all bad, modern technology, terrible. I think Marty's missed the point a little bit with all of that. The trouble is when this blue light or the exposure to blue light is at inappropriate times. So we really should be seeing a lot of natural light during the day. Actually, on a bright sunny day, you'll get about 100,000 lux of energy from the sun, of light exposure from the sun. The equivalent sitting in an office with sort of the LED lights there, probably about 300 or 400 lux. So it's a couple of orders of magnitude different to the amount of light exposure that our parents experienced and humans have been experiencing for thousands of years. So a very different level of exposure. And the trouble is when people like this are then going away at night time and having these high levels of exposure to blue light, and a lot of the LED screens, obviously we hold them quite close to our face. I'm glad my wife isn't here because she would say that I do this far too often, so I should practice what I preach a little bit more. But the effect of that is to, instead of having this really big difference between day and night, we should have a large exposure, this 100,000 versus basically 0 at night time. Now we're sort of getting 300 or 400 during the day, or the majority of our working day, and then we go home, and when the sun goes down, we just flick on the big screen LED TV, we jump in front of a computer, we have our cell phones in front of us, or a lot of people these days do. So instead of having this big swing between night and day, we're only really flattening it out. It gets a little bit confusing for our body, and it's not really sure whether it's daytime or nighttime anymore. And one of the problems with extending the day out like that and having this long day, so when we're exposed to this artificial light well into the evening, we're telling our bodies it's a really long day, and actually historically that would mean it's summertime. This is a great time to be out and about. This is a time when food is plentiful. So what our bodies and what our physiology is built to do is to say, hey, I'm going to make sure I take advantage of this time now when things are plentiful and bountiful, because I know that winter is coming. So I'm going to need to store up some of this energy, because I know that when winter comes, there's not going to be so much around. The trouble is, unlike for Jon Snow, winter's not really coming. There's some really interesting information from out of people that live close to the equator, and that actually the way their bodies work is a little bit different to people that have evolved away from the equator, because they're really used to a 12-hour day and a 12-hour night, and it really doesn't change very much depending on whether it's summer or winter. But when those people move away from the equator, so someone, say maybe Polynesian descent, moves to New Zealand, they're not really able to cope as well with these big swings in the seasons. So that could potentially be some of the underlying reason why there are some of these non-communicable diseases, that things like diabetes have this sort of higher prevalence in that sort of population. I guess we all sort of know. Are there any Americans here? We all sort of know that America leads the way in the obesity stats, right? But there's a study in The Lancet, which is a really well-regarded scientific journal. They studied about 20,000 people. They studied them across 33 years, so from 1980 to 2013. They tracked obesity levels in the population. And the sad story is that they said there are no national success stories in terms of countries that are doing a good job of dealing with the burgeoning waistlines of their population. Like say, USA is doing a pretty good job of being number one. I know they like to be number one in a lot of things, probably not very enviable this one. But New Zealand, if we look at boys under 20, if we combine the groups that were both overweight and obese, 29.6% of boys under 20 are classified as being either overweight or obese. And I know some of these statistics, and KP's going to hit me up straight away and say that's not the be-all and end-all measure of health, and I absolutely agree with that. But the reality is that the trend is moving in a not ideal direction. If we look at obesity, USA, number one in boys under 20. Adult males, overweight and obese, who do we think's number one? Who thinks USA? Who thinks someone a little closer to home? So 71.4% of adult males in New Zealand considered overweight or obese. Number one in the world. New Zealand girls under 20, we're second in the world, admittedly behind USA. Good work, USA. And adult women, we're sixth. But actually, most of the countries that beat us in in terms of the adult women levels of obesity and overweight, they actually place a really high value on having body mass. That's part of the opulence. It shows that they have wealth. Yeah. No questions from you, Kate. So, do we know who this is? Yeah. So, Alan Alda has almost nothing to do with my talk. It's just, MASH was a great show, and don't get me wrong. But one thing that's been suggested as contributing to the burgeoning waistlines of the planet has been artificial light at night. So ALAN, artificial light at night. Can I go? Yeah, it's going to just drop my... So there was an article that came out in 2014 in the Annals of Medicine saying that they really believe that artificial lighting may be one of the key contributors to the association between global urbanisation and the obesity increases in levels of obesity that are going on. There was a really interesting study that came out 2014. 113,000 participants, so that's a lot of participants. I'm normally lucky if I can get 10. These were women from the UK. They were involved in a breakthrough generation study. They were all over 16. I think the average age was just under 50. And what they did was they collected a bunch of data on these ladies over a number of years. And one of the questions they were interested in is the effect of artificial light at night on the prevalence of obesity and overweight. And one of the questions they asked to try and get a finger on that was, if you are lying in bed at night, after you've turned out all the lights, if you put your hand out, if you can see your hand, then you're in a certain group that's probably got quite a high level of light pollution. And actually, that was one of the key distinguishing features between people that were overweight versus not overweight. If you could see your hand, chances are you were overweight in that study of 113,000 individuals. So they went away and rechecked their numbers. They said, they took into account, hey, do these people smoke? Do these people do heaps of exercise? And even after they'd accounted for those types of lifestyle interventions, the people that could see their hand were still more likely statistically to be overweight. There was another study performed, pretty similar study, and it wasn't just BMI, it was waist-hip ratio and measures that are maybe a better indicator of our metabolic health. But there was actually a similar study done in Japan, 500 participants. Again, that's quite a lot of people in my world. And if Alan Alda was hanging out there, they actually had higher levels of triglyceride. They had a higher, the bad cholesterol in the blood, that the low density lipoproteins were actually much higher, and that was related to all-cause mortality. So if you could see your hand in bed, or there was a significant amount of light when you're sleeping, that was bad. And that was in elderly people, so they were all over 60 years old. So if that's not enough reason for you to maybe switch off the digital alarm clock in your room, then there's actually another study that's shown that flashing a blue light for 2 milliseconds, so that's to give you some context, most people when they blink, that's about 150 milliseconds. So 2 milliseconds flash of blue light while you're asleep, your eyes are closed, is enough. If you do that 2 milliseconds every 30 seconds for 1 hour, so that's a total dose of about less than quarter of a second, I'm going to say, 240 milliseconds. That's enough to change your sleep patterns, it's enough to change your biorhythm, it's enough to change your temperature change while you're asleep with your eyes closed. So There's some more interesting information about Alan Alda here, and you can see him from space, apparently. This is a study that looked at the light pollution across 80 countries, so they just got satellite images of the amount of light pollution across these different countries, and they could basically predict which countries would have a higher prevalence of overweight and obese people based on how much light was being detected from space. If they included a couple of other variables like gross domestic product, the amount of, the percentage of calories that were consumed from roots and tubers, so if that was high, the risk was lower in terms of body weight, they said they could predict with about 70% accuracy the prevalence of overweight and obese people in a country. So what's Alan doing? Why doesn't radar just come in and say, hey, Alan, cut it out? So what Alan does is really affects our sleep. Like I said, it can influence some of those biorhythms, even through our closed eyelids. I think we all can appreciate if we close our eyes and look up at the light, it's not completely dark, right? You know, if you look at the lights and then put your hands over your eyes, it's going to be darker. Yep. So even while we're asleep, this Alan Alda can sneak in and do some pretty nasty stuff. What we do know is that this artificial light at night can influence our level of slow-wave sleep. That's our deep sleep. That's a really restorative, recuperative sleep that we need. And that actually plays a really vital role in memory consolidation. It plays a role in some of the brain chemistry that goes on, and it's a really important time for us to be able to our brain actually flushes out a lot of the metabolites during this sort of period of sleep. So this artificial light can sneak in and do some really disrupt that type of restorative sleep. There's a study out of Harvard University, and they basically looked at a bunch of studies across the planet, and they found that studies from all 5 continents, and said that in all the works they studied, there was a positive association between this sleep being disrupted or short sleep duration and whether there was high levels of body weight being high. Yeah. The same study went on to say that unfortunately this effect seemed to be amplified in children. So children were especially vulnerable just because their physiology is changing so rapidly, and I guess we all appreciate at some level that young children need a lot more sleep than as we grow up and become adults, although my son at home doesn't seem to follow that particularly well. There was one study that was done, and basically they looked at the factors that would contribute to 5-year-olds and whether their chances of being obese when they were aged 5, and actually the body weight of the parents was significantly related to that. Actually, your chances of being heavy when you're aged 5 were 3 times greater if your parents were overweight. But in terms of environmental factors, so if your parents are overweight, 3 times more likely to be overweight. If you watched excessive television, that increased your odds again by about 1.2 times. The greatest predictor of whether that child at 5-year-old was going to be overweight was not snacks, was not watching TV, it was how long they slept for. You're 4.9 times more likely to be overweight as a 5-year-old if your sleep was very short. And unfortunately, Alan Alda doesn't stop there. He's still going. So what happens when we have a short sleep as well is that some of the hormones that tell us when we're hungry and when we're full get a little bit mixed up as well. And what you'll find is that people that haven't had good sleep or have had this slow wave sleep disrupted tend to make poorer food choices. There's a couple of studies in particular, but one study was a sleep debt study, and they basically showed that people that had a poor sleep or had a sleep deficit were that much more likely to take in things with a really high carbohydrate load, pretty not very nutrient dense, although those donuts do look good. Another aspect that isn't talked about so much with our modern society, so we've seen that it can affect our sleep, which is obviously quite poor. But it, also because we're awake at night time, we're awake for longer periods, the time that we actually eat has changed quite a lot from, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So there's some really interesting information from a study in mice. And basically, like I said earlier, these mice are nocturnal, so their active time is the night time. So if you feed them and they have exercise during the night time, they're fine, they're happy mice, probably sing songs about Mickey Mouse and all sorts of things. But if you give those mice exactly the same amount of food, give them exactly the same amount of exercise, but they get that food and exercise during the daytime, so that's the time they're supposed to be sleeping, they get quite sick and they get quite fat. So how does that translate to what we're doing currently ourselves? You'd say, well, that's mice, that doesn't, that's not really humans. There's another really interesting study in rats. I've shown almost exactly the same thing, that they basically tried to mimic shift work in rats and showed very, very similar results. If the work is done at the wrong time and the feeding is at the wrong time, that has negative consequences in terms of their metabolic health, how they deal with food, and also their body weight. Hasn't been a study done in chickens yet, but if someone wants to give me some money, we can go away and do a study in chickens. But there is a study in humans, so that's probably more relevant to us today. And basically what they showed was that if you ate more than 33% of your entire daily calories, so 33% was your dinner time and later, you're that much more likely to be overweight, actually about 2 times more likely to be overweight. So maybe there is something in that, the old wives' tale about breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper, So this poor shark has cancer. He's not going to be terrifying any young kids at the beach anytime soon, unfortunately. So there is actually, unfortunately, links between this artificial light at night and cancer prevalence. There's a lot of statistics around people that work shift work. There's studies done in nurses in particular showing that the levels of breast cancer are much higher in people that have this, that their body, the external cues that they're getting from the environment and their internal cues are out of whack. There's a really recent study out of Spain. They collected data across 5 years. I think they had 4,000 people in the study. Prostate and breast cancer were basically reduced by 20% if there was a long time between when you had dinner and when you went to bed. So if there was at least 2 hours between when you had your dinner and when you went to bed, your chance of getting prostate cancer or breast cancer, depending on whether you're a male or female, was 20% reduced. So really shows the importance of matching up our internal biorhythm with what's going on in the environment around us. And that's something that our modern lifestyle and a lot of our interaction with modern devices is actually having a pretty negative impact. It was a really interesting study where they took blood from women and they either took them during the day, so a nice sunny day, that's when our melatonin levels are really low because the sun is suppressing our melatonin. They took it during the night time, so the melatonin levels were really high. And they also took from the night time, but in those women that were exposed to artificial light at night. So what they did with that blood, they took it away and then they actually cultivated it with cancer cells. So if you put the very melatonin depleted blood from during the day in with a cancer cell, it actually grew, it proliferated, it was fairly happy in that low melatonin blood. But if you gave it the blood from the night time, so melatonin was really high in those samples, it actually suppressed and actually started killing the cancer cell. The cancer cell couldn't survive in that high melatonin blood. What do we think happened with the blood with the women that were taken at night time, but there was artificial light at night around? Do we think the cancer cells were happy with that? Yeah, so the cancer cells still grew. If you're exposing yourself to this artificial light at night, then your melatonin levels are going to be suppressed, and that's actually one of our key defences. Melatonin is one of our key defences against radical damage and cancer spreading. There's actually a really interesting book I read by Dr John Ott, and he went to the Congo and sort of just lived with the natives for a while, and a lot of the natives didn't actually wear very much. But when the Westerners arrived, they didn't really adopt too many of their Western ways, but they loved the sunglasses. Those things are stylish. But most people couldn't actually afford the sunglasses, so it was only really the rich people that got sunglasses. So they'd be walking around with their sunglasses and not much else. And they'd be rocking out. They'd be super, super happy. And what they did, they found that the level of the cancers that were experienced by this tribe that was quite remote in the Congo actually started to increase, but only in the rich people. So they're being exposed, well, they're blocking out some of the natural sunlight and some of these wavelengths of light that are actually quite important for us to signal what time of day it is, but also to signal our body to function correctly. I did mention about shift work, and actually there's been a paper come out by the Royal Society saying that shift work is actually now classified as a class 2A carcinogen. So there's 5 categories of carcinogenity. One is this is going to give you cancer, guaranteed. 2A, shift work. Yeah. That same paper from the Royal Society also said that excessive lighting of the night sky is an important and earth issue as climate change. That's how serious they think it is. And unfortunately, we're not the only people that live on this planet. There's lots of other insects and plant life around, and there's an interesting study from 2016. Some Swiss researchers gathered 1,000 larvae from moths and basically showed that, so they grabbed half of them from out on the farm, so these were moths that were used to it being dark at night time, and the other half they grabbed from in the city where there's obviously a lot of street lights and a little bit of light pollution around. And what they did when these moths hatched, they put them in a big room and they had light at one end. And what they found was that the moths that they'd taken from the city where there was a lot of light pollution, we all know moths, moth to a flame, they go towards the light. These moths didn't really, because they'd figured out it was actually an evolutionary advantage that if they went to the light, that's where all the predators hung out, because the predators knew that's where the moths go. So if you went to the light, you got eaten. So these moths had already evolved in quite a short period of time to not go towards the light, which is great if you're a moth and you don't want to get eaten, but it's not so great because essentially moths are like the bees of the night. They go around and they pollinate the flowers, they pollinate all the food crops. So if they don't travel around as much because they're not going towards the light, then they don't pollinate as much, and that's not ideal in terms of the ecosystem as a whole. So there's a few maybe takeaways or some ideas that we can think of here, and I think mainly what I want you to take away from today is to just be aware of our biorhythm and how some of these things can have an effect on our body. Must be getting close to time, which is good because the next slide is a summary slide. Try and keep it dark at night time. When you are trying to get to sleep, dark is good. Even a little bit of light can be quite detrimental to your sleep and to your health. Try to get outside during the day. Hey, we live in the Bay of Plenty. Why not get outside and enjoy some of the sunshine? Yeah. Try and not watch as much Game of Thrones as I do at night time. Try and limit the TV use and cell phone use into the night, and even try maybe. It's obviously easier at this time of year now that daylight savings has kicked in, but try to eat when the sun's up. Yeah. There's a great study that came from. They got a bunch of people who their biorhythms were actually quite out of whack. They were living in the city, and all they did was they went camping for a week, and within that 1 week a lot of the issues that they were having in terms of their biorhythms were sorted out. They realigned themselves with the sun coming up and the sun going down. Yeah. So here's the summary. Blue light's an important signal. It's fine at appropriate times. It's great to get out and see the sun, but try and avoid it at night times because that can have health implications. Healthy living involves getting outside. It's not just what we eat and it's not just the exercise we're doing. There are a lot of other things involved in being healthy. I think when we eat, it's not just what we eat, and again, I'm not a medical doctor, so please don't attack me too much, but when we eat, there's enough information out there now to say that can actually have a pretty big effect on outcomes. And sleep in the dark, yeah. So I'm just going to touch on, let a couple of people take some photos over here. Mental Health Awareness Week next week. Mental Health Foundation runs a great site. Please support them if you can. www.depression.org. We've probably seen the ads on TV with John Kerwin. It's a really serious condition. If you know anyone or having any sort of symptoms yourself where you're not enjoying things as much as you used to, there's a toll-free number there, and you can text free. Trained counsellors available 24/7. Thanks.
Marty, thank you so much. I have an 18-year-old daughter who's going to be spoken to this evening. Convince her that YouTube is not her best friend at night. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, we are filming, so I need to bring the mic to you. Could you raise your hand for Marty? Over here.
A lot of us are going over to LED lighting. We get warm white and cold white. Is the cold white blue light, is that healthier for you?
At the right time of day, it's better for you to be exposed to that type of light. And a lot of they're experimenting now with smart lighting systems where actually that light will change to a warmer colour as the sun goes down. So I actually have on my computer, you can download a program there, it's called f.lux, and you can tell when the sun goes down because my screen changes from being quite bright and it starts getting a warmer sort of red colour. So those types of light are important, not as beneficial, I would say, as getting outside in the sunlight, but they will be helpful if you are confined indoors or if you're having to work like some of us. Then that sort of lighting is better than the standard. Yeah.
Raise your hand, please. I'll go down the back.
Thank you. 2 questions, please. Is there any correlation between those cultures that eat late at night, like Spain, and obesity? And the second question is, are Kindles inherently bad for you compared to books?
So yeah, that study was actually done in Spain that I mentioned, and what they call the 2 hours after dinner was actually pretty late for, like, they were talking about going to bed at, or the dinner time being prior to 9 p.m. level of association only became evident when they ate later than 9 p.m. And I'm more than happy to give you the reference details as well there if you want to actually have a look. It's actually a really interesting read, just came out this year. And Kindles versus books, short answer, I'm going to go yes, they're worse.
Any other questions? Excuse me.
We've got a couple of little kids and we went out of our way to find a red nightlight. Mm-hmm. Now you're making us reconsider that. Have you got any comments about sort of nightlights for kids?
So red's probably the least harmful light in terms of the signal to our brain is actually a quite small wavelength, and that is what we perceive as being blue. So red's obviously sort of the other end of the spectrum to that. So that's, I would say, is a better option. Night lights in general, I would say I would avoid, yeah, if possible, yeah.
Somebody over here.
My optician tells me that I should wear dark glasses during the day because otherwise I'm going to be affected and I'm going to lose some of my sight. You're telling me that I shouldn't wear dark glasses because... And I know that you're not a health doctor, but you're still telling me that thing. I'm just wondering if you've got a comment on that.
It's a really good question, and I'm glad someone asked it just to make me squirm. But actually, sunglasses are a reasonably new invention. A lot of people wear them for fashion as opposed to necessarily some sort of medical reason. If you have dry eyes, then it's important to look after your eye health. If you're out in the sun all day and there's a lot of glare, then yes, it's important to minimise some of that. So if you're going skiing or if you're out at the beach, but the very pervasive wearing of sunglasses is probably not as necessary as maybe some health professionals would have you believe. I actually find it interesting. I haven't stopped wearing sunglasses completely, but I've stopped a lot. And I notice when I go outside with a lot of my friends, they're squinting. They're struggling to be outside with the bright sunlight without some sort of covering on their eyes. And that's not how humans have been for thousands and thousands of years.
Is it beneficial to have a blue light screen on top of your phone if you're going to use it after a certain time? Will that mitigate some of the risk almost?
Yep, some of those aren't super effective, and some of the level of light with the new technology now, the LED on the new iPhone 10, I remember reading some research saying that even with that blue light blocker on the iPhone 10, it's worse than the iPhone, I think it was the 7, because the size of the screen is different and the intensity of the light is different, but it is a step in the right direction.
Final question. Final two.
Killing me, Joanna.
Hi. I have my phone charging beside the bed at night because I need it for the alarm clock in the morning, and it's got the little circle with blue light that pulsates to show that it's charging. Is that harmful, or
I would
do
put
I
a pillow over it or something if you can, try and cover it up.
The other way. Cool.
Hi there. My question is, we've just put in all new windows in our house, and I'm from the UK, so I'm quite concerned actually about how bright and how dangerous the sun is in New Zealand as compared to the UK. We've just paid a fortune to have all our windows made really dark. You know, and obviously in the winter that will make a difference with regard to how much sun comes through. What's your view on that, really?
Yeah. To be honest, again, humans have been around for thousands and thousands of years, and we've been able to cope with sort of a graduated approach to sunlight. I know there have been, the ozone layer and the depletion and the sun is much, much harsher here than it has been or would be from the UK and even around the Mediterranean where people spend a lot of time in the sun. But, yeah. Cancer's a scary thing, and I think taking those precautions to avoid skin cancer where you can. I think probably covering up with clothing is probably a better way to go than necessarily. I think it's great that you've got these big windows, but maybe you can open them sometimes.
Marty, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just introduce our Acting Dean for the Faculty of Health, Sport and Human Performance, Dr Kirsten Petrie, who